Okay, so the other, and so in line with this second part of the reading, I wanted to just say a little bit more about this section of the reading titled Growth of Knowledge, which is on page 3. And this seems to be a focal point for O'Hear. So in the first part, he's sort of dealing with two questions throughout this reading. He wants to say, well, what's so great about science? And the reason we like science so much is because it makes our lives possible, is that without science and technology, our modern lives would not be possible. But then that's sort of a practical question. What's so great about science? Makes our lives possible. But what about, why do we prefer science to other ways of thinking or studying the world? And here O'Hear wants to sort of focus on the fact that with science, we do not have to concern ourselves so much with its history. Whereas with something like philosophy or literature or music, we are more concerned with its history. And it's not to say that we don't need to be aware of science's history, because of course we wouldn't want to simply repeat the same errors and mistakes that scientists from the past have. The entire point is to, but that in itself tells us the value that science's history has is that we don't want to repeat it. But insofar as science has value, it's what it provides us for the present and for the future. Science makes progress. It's one of the key notions associated with modern science and the Enlightenment in general, is that of progress. Whereas somebody could look at a subject like philosophy and sort of joke that, well, 2,000 years later, we are still reading Plato. That isn't to say that makes science better. It certainly makes science different. But some might make an argument that that does make science better, is that philosophy and literature and something like music and art, they're all things that do allow us to express ourselves, our creativity, and they can make human experience more meaningful. But do they really make progress? Do they give us anything new? Well, yes and no. I'm sure some of you were listening to this and saying, yes, there's been developments in music and there's been developments in literature and things like that. Yes, there have been developments, but by and large, we don't regard the history of these subjects as somehow irrelevant. Otherwise, you wouldn't start a philosophy course by reading Plato. And so the entire value of science does not lie in studying its history. The history of science has value only insofar as we do not want to repeat it. And O'Hear makes another argument, which you may or may not agree with, but he says, look, in philosophy, or let's say in music, for example, no one would say that that somehow Beethoven is worse because he made his music a long time ago, whereas and somehow Taylor Swift is better than Beethoven because she's writing her music now. No, I mean, that kind of argument is obviously sort of silly on its face. No one would agree with that kind of argument. Whereas with science, we might make that kind of argument. We might say, for example, that this scientist and this theory is better than its predecessor simply because it's current and it is up to date. It has overcome the flaws of that which came before it. And so O'Hear really kind of wants to come down pretty strongly on this point that the value of science lies in the fact that it is forward-looking. It is overcoming its past, whereas these other subjects are consumed with their past. We are still reading and thinking about questions and interpreting great books, for example, and figuring out what the proper interpretation is of literature and philosophy. Whereas in science, no, we are every day engaged in experiments and hypotheses that are going to help solve human problems now, or tomorrow, or a year from now. But we make progress with science, whereas with these other things, we don't really make any progress. And that seems to be a fundamental feature of the answer to the question, why do we prefer science to other subjects? Because science makes progress. So O'Hear by this point has kind of answered two questions. Why do we value science? We value it because it makes our lives possible. Why do we prefer science? Because science allows us to make progress. Other areas of human inquiry do not make progress. So that gets us to the third section. And I just want to say a little bit about this third section titled Objectivity and the External World, which appears on page 6 of this first reading. And in this section, you really do get some very strong language from O'Hear that really does kind of prefigure what Bacon is going to say in his reading. And it really does capture something about the modern view of what nature is. And the modern view of what nature is informs what the activity and practice of science is going to look like. So as a result of the conception of nature, it tells us how we ought to conduct science. And the view of nature that we have, and O'Hear captures this pretty well. At the bottom of page 6, O'Hear writes, the impartiality of nature to our feelings, beliefs, and desires means that the work and testing and developing of scientific theories is insensitive to the ideological background of individual scientists. So the truth of science, the things that you discover as a result of doing experiments and testing hypotheses, has nothing to do with you. Of course, insofar as you chose to study this particular thing as opposed to that particular thing, yes, that has to do with you. But the truths themselves, regardless, what you study is up to you. But what is discovered once you've chosen what to study has nothing to do with you. It's simply revealed to you that nature doesn't care about your feelings. Nature doesn't care about your beliefs. It's insensitive to your feelings. So nature is impartial. Nature is this thing that's kind of over there and we're over here, and we are simply trying to get nature to reveal its secrets to us. But it has nothing to do with us. That the truth of science will simply be revealed to us if we do our science in the right way and not make it about us. And that really captures this modern scientific spirit and worldview. And you're really going to get this with Bacon. And O'Hear seems to be suggesting that he, to an extent, agrees with this way of thinking about what nature is and what science is. And so this is the beginnings of this thing that I've referred to, and I will refer to it, you'll hear it throughout the course, as the value-free ideal. That the way we ought to pursue science is without values. That is the ideal we should hold up for ourselves, and that's how we should pursue it. And the value-free ideal presupposes this concept of nature as a kind of object and machine-like thing that kind of does what it does. Its processes are ongoing and they have nothing to do with us. We simply observe it, study it, and make prediction based on what we've observed as it relates to the future. So science has nothing to do, or nature has nothing to do with us. And because nature has nothing to do with us, the activity of science is simply revealing nature to ourselves, but not insofar as we want anything to be true. So you really get some really strong language here in this section that kind of prefigures what Bacon is going to say about how science ought to be conducted. And so that's really all I have to say about that section. The final section just talks about some of the essential features of science. It's titled Prediction and Explanation, and it just talks about how, insofar as we're doing science, we hope that science can explain the world to us and also predict the way the world will continue to be in the future. And so science has explanatory value and predictive value. And these are some of the essential features of what science is. And indeed, for induction, that's what some prediction is going to be essential to the inductive method of science. It's the idea that the way things have been will continue to be that way, and we kind of have to assume that if we're going to do induction. So that's really all I have for this first lecture video on this reading science as intellectual activity. It's just kind of it's the goal of beginning the course this way is to put an image in front of you of what science is. And I think this is a very dominant view of what science is. Even though Francis Bacon wrote a long time ago, this image of science as a value-free endeavor that has nothing to do with us is a very powerful way of thinking about science. We're going to be thinking about some critiques of that as we move forward in the course, but nonetheless, the goal of this is to have that image of science in front of you to begin the course and to think about that, and we're going to kind of come back to that image as we proceed throughout the course. So that's all I have.